Hello all, and welcome to the November Patch Tuesday webcast. We will begin in just a few short moments, but before we do, I'd like to remind all attendees they're currently in listen-only mode. But please feel free to ask questions of our panelists at any time, and we will answer them during the live Q&A session at the end. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Heidi. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November Patch Tuesday webcast. As you can see, we're all wearing our favorite Patch Tuesday t-shirts. We really appreciate you taking the next hour to spend with us to discuss Patch Tuesday, third-party software, Linux, macOS updates for this month. And as usual, I've invited two experts from my team to help me. So maybe, John, you'd like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Everyone, John Cassell, Senior Solutions Architect with Syxsense. I'm based in sunny California. I've been working in IT for many years, specializing in desktop and server operations. And at Syxsense, a devil in pre-sales, customer onboarding, and training.
Lovely, thank you, John. And Pete.
Yeah, hi, Rob. Hi, everybody. My name's Pete, and I've worked for Syxsense as a pre-sales consultant for about 5 years. Prior to my current role, I worked for an oil company where I managed a on-premise solution, which was used to manage around 4,500 devices. We used it for general asset management, software deployment, and of course, patch management.
Wonderful, thank you, Pete. And once again, I'm Rob Brown. I'm the UK Head of Services, currently in lockdown 2, so we're still working from home at the moment. One of my divisions is the services. In the services division is to supply patch management managed services, and over the last 10 or so years, we've deployed over 100 million patches. So welcome to everyone for joining today. So I've made some notes. We actually had an unprecedented amount of feedback, and we really appreciate every one of the webcasts we've done for the last 6 months. We do get quite a lot of feedback to improve what content is in the webcast, so everyone actually comes along and finds this very valuable. So we didn't. So firstly, the news page. The news slide in the webcast is made larger. The font was too small. Apparently, it was really difficult to see. I really appreciate that. These are the kind of things we don't think about when we're putting as much data on the screen as possible. So we have split those across 2 slides when there's a lot to cover. And also on the Linux feedback, thank you guys for all of your Linux feedback. The reason why we add Linux into this webcast is because a lot of clients of ours and prospects are actually running hybrid environments. So they're using Microsoft and they're using Linux, and some of that technology actually crosses in the middle. And Microsoft actually supply a Linux-based patch for something that is in that hybrid environment. So what we've done is we have taken the top 10 most important vulnerabilities of the month for the Linux operating systems, and we've put them into the webinar. But on the release cadence, and thank you guys for all of your feedback about the Linux release cadence. If you're not familiar, Linux actually has a much faster release cadence of patches than Microsoft. Whereas Microsoft releases content once per month for security, Linux can actually release that content on a weekly basis. And so putting the content in a webcast that appears once a month is actually potentially showing the most important patches of the month, but maybe not the very latest patches of the month, and those are called packages. So at Syxsense, we've thought about this, and starting in December, we're going to be publishing to the website the Linux vulnerabilities of the week. So each Monday, you'll see a new article which lists the most important Linux vulnerabilities of the week from the previous week. So if you come along to the website, you'll see and you can subscribe to that. So, but once again, we really appreciate your feedback. Please keep sending that to us. So news, this is released this week. It's the Microsoft .NET 5 final. It was released for Windows, macOS, Linux, and the ARM operating systems. What I expect to see in December is that the patches will obviously be released to fix vulnerabilities in that .NET version. I don't know if they are going to retire the old ones, but that does mean that there's probably more patches to cover off next month if you're adopting that new technology. Microsoft have also released a patch to remove Flash from the Internet Explorer browser. So if what that means is because Flash is coming to end of life at the end of this year, the Internet Explorer browser, this patch will actually disable the Flash extension, and it will stop it from being installed again. But if you're using Edge or Mozilla or Google Chrome, those are called Chromium-based browsers, and that will be disabled automatically at some point in January when those vendors decide to release a patch for that. But if you need to disable Flash before then, you'll need to create a script that to deploy to your devices. We also have a new Intel microcode this month. So there's Windows 10 and Windows Server microcode updates. Very, very important that you apply those microcode updates because they fix the Intel CPU security bugs. And we have talked about that previously in a few webinars from now. So please be aware there are new microcodes. They came out just late last night, so please make sure that you're applying those in your strategy. Also, earlier on this month, we had a Google Chrome update to resolve a actively exploit or weaponized bug. I'm sure John will cover more of that. And if you're still using Windows 10 1809 feature update, it actually came end of life yesterday. So if you are still using that feature update on Windows 10 Home or Pro edition, please let us know if you need any help with the strategy to get you to the very latest supported version of feature updates. And I know, again, John, you have some information on feature updates for us later on in the webinar. And also, lastly, Cisco, they've actually fixed a major bug for WebEx. So if you are using Cisco WebEx, you do need to apply that update. It was about an 8.0 CVSS score rating. And if you're using Syxsense, you can find all of everything I've covered here inside your patch manager interface. So just search for the version or the function that you're looking for, and you'll be able to find that for immediate deployment. And that being said, John, you have you've done lots of research on third parties. Would you want to take us through what you've been researching?
Yep, thank you, Rob. It's been an interesting last month. A lot of various vulnerabilities across different browser platforms, so I'll cover a few of these off. Before that, of course, third-party patches are just as important as the operating system updates to remedy any potential vulnerabilities. Since last month, again, additional updates have been released. I usually go through these based on severity as well. Starting with the first, last week, Adobe released patches for 14 separate flaws across Acrobat and Reader products within Windows and Mac. Some critical flaws to highlight include a heap-based overflow, buffer overflow, an out-of-bands write glitch, and 2 use after free flaws. The rest of the vulnerabilities include important and moderate severity vulnerabilities. And for a lot of them that I'll be going through, there are multiple version releases too, as pointed out in the slide. So with each one of these various versions that have been released in the last month, I won't get too specific, but instead focus on the severity. Again, important and moderate severity vulnerabilities for the Adobe products. Typically, Adobe releases updates on the second Tuesday of the month, like Microsoft. However, in this case, the release did fall on the Tuesday before, and Adobe also mentioned that for these flaws, there are currently no known exploits. Google Chrome has been updated a few times since last month, with previous versions in late October and early November, resolving multiple critical vulnerabilities, especially with the 0-day related to a type of memory corruption flaw. The newest version, however, was not as severe as the earlier ones. These releases applied to multiple operating systems, such as Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, and iOS, although definitely prioritize the desktop versions. The version from October 20th of Google Chrome did include multiple vulnerabilities, as well as the earlier November release did too. The latest release from Monday did include a high severity fix as well, but no matter which version you're on, given that many releases have been actually pushed out within the last month, you should definitely migrate to the latest version if you haven't already. Microsoft Edge, which is also Chromium based, received multiple releases too. It's of course the same type of browser since last patch Tuesday. The release from late October did include those critical fixes for the same CVEs resolved in Chrome, as did Edge release last week. These vulnerabilities in both Chrome and Edge have been reported to be actively exploited, and this is greatly increasing the priority, of course. If Google Chrome or the new Microsoft Edge again are being used in the environment, be sure to update as soon as possible to alleviate these active exploits. Also browser related, Firefox and Thunderbird by Mozilla have received multiple releases too since last month. The prior versions were released in mid to late October to resolve industry-rated critical vulnerabilities, as well as rated high and critical from Mozilla. And this is pretty rare for vendors to also supply their own type of severity. So if that ever occurs, I would always recommend to prioritize as well. The Mozilla bugs include use after free issues, application and print scaling problems, WebSocket errors, and the latest version for both Firefox and Thunderbird resolved a critical vulnerability related to an exploitable use after free condition. And that latest version was just released yesterday for desktop versions. Cisco WebEx meetings, as Rob had pointed out earlier, also saw multiple releases in the last month, with the latest resolving a high severity bug. These multiple releases included a huge amount of enhancements and bug fixes across both Windows and Mac. And of course, this list of enhancements is far too great to go through one by one here. But considering the high severity vulnerability, I would definitely recommend to prioritize Cisco WebEx as well to the latest release when possible. Especially with the huge influx of work from home, many organizations are dependent on these types of products as well. Additional products have also seen updates since last patch Tuesday, including Citrix Workspace, Dropbox, FileZilla, Flash Player, which I would also like to remind everyone will be coming to an end shortly, as Adobe will no longer support Flash after December 31st of this year. Adobe is continuing to encourage the use of open HTML5 standards in place of Flash. Some additional third-party products also include iTunes, Java as well, with version 8, revision 271 being released, Notepad++, Opera, Skype, Wireshark, and Zoom. And there are, of course, many others as well. Those are just high priorities. Lastly, my monthly reminder to all administrators, again, always include third-party updates in your patching cycle. It's not just always about the operating system updates. Usually ends up being a much smaller chunk, considering that operating system updates are from very specific vendors. There are, of course, many other applications out there from third-party vendors. Something I'd also like to note, earlier in the month, or I should say later last month, I read a report from Checkpoint that asserted that Microsoft is actually the most imitated brand for phishing emails. Behind Microsoft was DHL, Google, PayPal, Netflix, Facebook, Apple, WhatsApp, Amazon, and Instagram. And this can, of course, affect consumers as well as end users within an organization. Just wanted to note this, as last month I did mention that based on an attendee question, that the end users themselves are the greatest vulnerability, and this is definitely not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Checkpoint even mentioned that this could ramp up with more and more end users working remotely across the globe. End users should continuously be trained and educated not to click any of the emails that every email that they see, I should say. Check the source and report always anything malicious.
Very, very great advice. Thank you, John.
Mm-hmm.
That's brilliant. There's a lot covered off this month. Certainly, that's really good. Thank you. Okay, so this is one of my favorite parts of the Patch Tuesday webinar, where we get to where Pete gets to present something that he's been working on for the month, and specifically in his role in pre-sales, as well as John. He's actually been looking at some of the more frequently asked questions that he has asked, both in pre-sales, but also whilst they're in the community and they help clients that actually require it. So Pete, would you like to let us know what you've been working on this month for us?
Yeah, no problem at all, Rob. Yeah, in fact, it's been quite easy this month because all I've had to do is just collate all the questions that we get asked and just list them and answer them, really. So, yeah, it's not been too hard this month. But yeah, if we can have the first question, please, Rob. Okay, so I'll read out the question just for ease. So how should I choose a priority when deploying patches? Okay, so obviously there's quite a lot of different methods that you can use here, but how you decide the priority in which order to deploy patches can some degree depend on the information that your patch deployment tool provides. If it only gives you vendor rating, then that is the only method that you could actually use and choose. Our product gives you several scoring systems, which include the vendor rating and the CVSS score, which basically goes from NA to 10. We also give you the Syxsense rating system as well. So personally, if I had to choose between a vendor rating and the CVSS score, I would always choose the CVSS score because it is largely independent from the vendor's opinion with regards to the severity of the vulnerability. Okay, next question, please, Rob. How can I deploy Microsoft, or can I deploy Microsoft and third-party patches in the same deployment process? Again, well, yes, personally, I see no reason why you cannot deploy third-party patches at the same time as Microsoft patches. And as John mentioned, remember that third-party patches can account for up to 70%, in fact, of the total number of vulnerabilities in your estate. So it's certainly worth not excluding them by any means. If anything, you should actually concentrate on them. Okay, next question, please, Rob. Can I treat desktop devices the same as laptop devices with regards to deploying patches? Again, this is my personal opinion, and I think that 99% of the time you could treat both devices the same way. But having said that, you need to be aware that some patches relate to firmware, or the firmware that's installed on the device, and obviously that firmware relates to the hardware of the device. Therefore, it can differ between different device types. So overall, I think the best solution here is to make sure that your testing process includes both laptops and desktops in your testing group, therefore minimizing the risk of a patch causing a problem to one type or another type of device. Next question, please, Rob. Okay, what will happen with regards to patches when the feature, but this is obviously Windows 10, when the feature version on any Windows 10 device is no longer supported by Microsoft? John talks about feature updates quite a lot. They're very important. The information that your tool provides may well differ from one tool to another. Some may state that the device requires patches and even requires new patches when they are released, but the problem is that you will not be able to deploy them. Or in other words, if you actually do deploy those patches, they will uninstall on the reboot. Other tools may therefore choose to state that the device is not vulnerable to any patches because clearly nothing can actually be installed on that device. Personally, I think the truth actually lies somewhere in the middle of that. The device may well be vulnerable to vulnerabilities, have vulnerabilities, but you cannot actually deploy patches to fix those vulnerabilities, and that would be a more representative of the actual state of such devices. To sum up though, obviously, keeping your devices within the feature update, make sure that that is supported, is vital if you want to patch those devices. Okay, next question, Rob. Okay, I know that some of my devices require patches to be installed, but when I try to deploy them, they fail to install. What could be the reason for this? There are at least 3 reasons that I can think of why a patch may fail to install on a device. The first being that the device is pending a reboot, and we see that an awful lot. I think rebooting devices goes hand in hand with patch management. Microsoft basically quite often write into the logic into the actual binary file that's being deployed to prevent it from actually being installed if the device is pending a reboot. You know, the tool can actually attempt to deploy it, but the actual file says I'm not installing. The reason that they do this is to obviously protect the device and protect the patch itself from becoming corrupt upon the reboot. The second reason is that the patch has been superseded by a new patch, and the new patch has already been installed. If the detection logic of the deployment tool that you're using is not aware of supersedence of patches, then this could cause what we would class as a false positive, stating that a patch is required, but you simply, when you try and install it, it will fail to install. The third reason could be that the tool that you're using is incorrectly reporting that the patch is required, when in fact it does not actually need to be installed. Here at Syxsense, we do see this from time to time, where a customer will use a third-party tool, basically checking up on our tool to see whether a patch is actually required to be installed. We would simply state, well, download that patch, try and install the patch and see what the actual patch says. So install it in a visible mode, and invariably the patch itself will pop up a message saying that it's not required on the device. And again, we would class that as a false positive. It's incorrect detection logic, and it can cause quite a lot of problems and concern when you see that one tool says a patch is required and another tool says that it isn't. I'd like to, stick up for our product, and I would say invariably we are proved correct, and the easy way of doing that is just try and install the patch, and it will tell you whether it's required or not. So yeah, that's the top 5 questions that we seem to get asked an awful lot, both during training and as a result of running these webinars. So hopefully at least 1 or 2 of those would be useful for you guys out there.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Pete. Thank you. And I was just actually writing down here servicing stack updates, because I'm going to cover that in a second. When to treat devices such as laptops and desktops differently, you do need to make sure that the servicing stack that you're using is supported, because servicing stack updates are provided to allow better integration between the operating system and the hardware. So if your hardware is slightly older or newer, you do need to make sure you get your servicing stack into the patching strategy. It doesn't always apply at the same time. So as I'm going to talk about, I'm just writing this down because I'm going to cover that again in the slide. But brilliant, Pete. Thank you very much.
No problem.
That's really good. Okay, so let's look at the Patch Tuesdays in November. And if you're a regular, you'll know that there's actually more than one Patch Tuesday in a month. There's actually up to 3 Patch Tuesdays in a month. The first Tuesday is for the non-security office updates. Now, for November, we had a rather large list. We actually only had 4 last month. We have 5 this month. So we had updates for Skype for Business, Office 2016, and there were 2 of those, Outlook and Project. So all of those are non-security related. So they can address user interface issues or non-security based issues or bugs. Yesterday, we had 112 security fixes in what we know as Patch Tuesday. I actually thought that we were going to slightly reduce the number, because over the last 6 months we've had 5 months where there's been over 100 security fixes. Obviously that is cumulative, but the larger the cumulative updates, the larger the patches, the more difficulty you'll have deploying them. And there have been some very important ones released yesterday we need to talk about. We had another month with no .NET Framework updates, but there are preview updates, and I just want to cover what they are. So a preview update is a .NET Framework version that you can choose to install, but the caveat is that Microsoft doesn't support them. So they might actually be a version of .NET Framework that's going to be released in the next Patch Tuesday. It does actually state, though, when you install the preview version, that any issues you have isn't supported by the vendor, and your only alternative is to uninstall and revert back to a previous version. Obviously, .NET 5 is now released, so that there's potential you've already been seeing some of those already. We haven't had any out-of-band Microsoft updates in the last 30 days, which has been great, but we do have something that I would classify as a zero-day vulnerability in this Patch Tuesday, and we have one advisory as well. So the advisory is servicing stack. Now, I mentioned in the last webinar that Microsoft had at last decided to combine the servicing stack with their cumulative updates, but not for all cumulative updates. You have to be on Windows 10 2004 with the September cumulative update in order to support future automatic integrated servicing stack updates. So servicing stack updates, they're really important that if Microsoft releases them and you are installing the patches off the network, for example, you're installing the patches manually, or you have a DMZ network and you're installing these patches manually, one at a time, you must make sure that you review the servicing stack updates for your operating system, and they must be applied before the update. If you don't, you actually may have an unstable patch install that can cause the patch to roll back on the next reboot. And if you've seen rollbacks before, they can actually cause more damage than actually installing patches. So please review the latest servicing stack updates. With Syxsense, we actually link the latest servicing stack update as a prerequisite within our content, so you don't have to worry about it. But if you're using other tools, you just need to review, make sure those tools are. If you're using Windows Update, that also automatically links those as prerequisites, so you don't have to worry about it. But again, if you're installing off the network or in a network that doesn't have access to the internet, you must make sure that you install it. Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to prioritize Patch Tuesday. We actually use 6 factors to decide the score that we give it in the priority of every single one of the patches that is released to resolve a vulnerability. The first we use is the vendor severity, and that's by the vendor, and it's typically critical, high, medium, all the way to low. There is actually a severity called NA, which means it's not classified as a security threat. Then we have the CVSS score, which has a similar scoring system, but it's a number. So it's 10 to 0, with 10 being critical and 0 being low. Every vulnerability can be, or any vulnerability can become weaponized. And weaponized means that it is actively being used to exploit. So when we say active exploit, that is what we call weaponized. So it is actually being currently weaponized, and it's very, very important that you prioritize those updates above all others. Public aware is actually broken into 2 parts. You've got publicly aware vulnerability, where a patch does exist, and that is what is released by the vendor to resolve the vulnerability. And then you have publicly aware vulnerabilities where a patch does not exist. And that's slightly more serious. So if the vendor hasn't said that this vulnerability exists, then you would require something like a security or vulnerability scanning solution to identify the areas of your operating system that could be used to exploit your operating system, that Microsoft later then comes behind it with a patch. Countermeasures are in 2 parts as well. A countermeasure is broken down into a mitigation. So maybe you're mitigated. You mitigate the need to deploy a patch because you have a sophisticated antivirus solution, or you have some kind of disk encryption that means that you don't need it. But also you've got workarounds. So maybe you don't need to deploy the patch if you can apply a group policy change, or you could apply a registry change. And those are things that help us to almost deprioritize a patch. If those countermeasures exist, it means you have another option. And if you're working with a large, highly distributed workforce and users are at home, it may not be so easy to deploy a patch. It may be easier to add a registry key. So those countermeasures do help us, but it is very important to know that some of those countermeasures can either remain in place after you patch, or they need to be removed. And we actually put all of that as well into the website article. Lastly, the only thing we can't help you with is your exposure, unless of course you're using Syxsense. So if you take those 5 and put them together, if you have critical, vendor, and CVSS, if there's a weaponized vulnerability, or it's public and or publicly aware, with or without a countermeasure, put those into your tool set, search for it, and where you find these are mostly true and your environment is mostly exposed, that is your priority for that month, to make sure that you are deploying the most important patches to resolve those vulnerabilities. So we have actually put all of that together onto an article on our website, which we don't put here into the webinar, of course. It's much easier to access it offline. So we have put everything onto our website. So go to syxsense.com, and I'll just bring it across now. So syxsense.com, there is a news page along the top. That is the general news page for all of our content. So we release content not just for Patch Tuesday, but also the 0-day vulnerabilities, etc., as we mentioned. We have a dedicated holding page purely for Patch Tuesday as well. If you need help, doesn't matter what tool set you're using, if you need help with a patching strategy, you regularly get these download now at the top. You can download that. It takes you through 10 steps to gaining success with whatever tool set you're using. And if you need extra help, there is the chat down here in the corner. Now, as I mentioned, you can go to the November Patch Tuesday article online right now. It's published on the day of Patch Tuesday. If you don't want to come here, you can subscribe. So if you enter your email address here, we'll send you an email with a link to this article each and every time we put a new article online. Okay, so let's just quickly go through what was released yesterday. We had another plus 100 fix release, which is a bit of a nightmare, especially coming up to the end of the year. Obviously, I'm not going to mention what's coming, but we actually were hoping to have a slightly easier end to the year. But we had 112 vulnerabilities in total, including 17 critical, 93 important, and 2 marked low. Those are the severities of the vendor. Obviously, we have to verify that against CVSS as well. But unfortunately, we do have a weaponized threat to urgently resolve. There are many of the Microsoft platforms updated, from Internet Explorer to Office, as well as the operating systems. And if you are still on the legacy operating systems, Windows 7 and Windows 2008, if you have subscribed to the extended support, the ESU program, you will have 20 vulnerabilities for each of these to remediate. 20, 2 critical, and 18 important. Now, I've chosen, as usual, I choose a few of my really important ones, and I know Pete and John have selected one each, or maybe more than one. We'll get to that in a second, to talk about what you should be prioritizing if you are in an environment where you have limited capability to roll out. You need to specifically select the patches that are most urgent. The first one is 17087, and this is a Windows Kernel local elevation of privilege vulnerability. This is the one I mentioned that is both weaponized and publicly aware. So this is classified, in our opinion, as 0-day. It does need to be targeted. It has no countermeasure, unfortunately, so the only remediation of this vulnerability is the deployment of the patch. Now, it is a buffer overflow vulnerability for Windows Kernel. It was actually found when they exposed the Google Chrome 0-day, as we mentioned earlier. So that 0-day Chrome vulnerability actually exposed this one. So it has been around for a little bit. Now, it's quite serious because that overflow allows a hacker to break out of the sandbox. So when you're using Google Chrome or Windows, there's a sandbox created, and you can actually jump out of that into the operating system. It actually affects almost every operating system from 7 onwards, and does require a reboot. Where we say reboot maybe, Microsoft means yes. If they say no, they mean no. But if they say maybe or yes, it means you do need to reboot, unfortunately. The second one is 17051, and this is a Windows network file system vulnerability, and it has a CVSS score of 9.8, making this one of the top 3 vulnerabilities for the month. It also has no countermeasure. Now, the reason why it's a 9.8 is that it's not, and NFS isn't likely to be used anywhere, is not likely to be used everywhere. But certainly if you're using NFS in your environment, especially if you're in a hybrid environment like we mentioned at the beginning, so if you are using Linux and Windows, you most likely will be using NFS. So this is one you need to definitely target. It is more likely to be exploited as well. So you do need to apply this patch and also reboot the devices that you're patching. And then the last one is 17042, which is a Windows error reporting elevation of privilege vulnerability. It has a CVSS score of 8.8, and it has no countermeasure. The reason why this is quite urgent, this critical vulnerability, is because it doesn't require a complex access or user privileges to infect the system. So if that was to become weaponized, they'd be able to do it very, very easily, and they wouldn't need any user privileges in order to exploit it. And that affects all operating systems from Windows 7 onwards all the way through. Again, it does require reboot, and there is no workaround. So I hope those are our top 3. So all you have to do is pop the CVEs into your tool set, search for those, and make sure that the cumulative update that is linked to is deployed to all of your detected devices. So maybe, John, you'd like to give me, maybe you've got one you'd like me to search. I can bring it up on the screen.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I chose CVE 2020-17053. There we go.
Oh, yes.
This is a Internet Explorer memory corruption vulnerability. This has a CVSS score, industry rating, not Microsoft specifically, of 7.5. It is likely for exploitation. The vulnerability exists due to a boundary error in Internet Explorer. A remote attacker can create a specially crafted web page, trick the victim into visiting it, and trigger memory corruption and execute arbitrary code on the target system. This does apply to pretty much every version of Windows 10 that is current. So I would prioritize that, of course, for any workstation or laptop, any real end user device, but also does apply to Windows Server 2019. So being on the server side as well, it's fairly important. May not be using browsers too often on a server, but if you happen to be using IE, especially 11, definitely prioritize. I chose this specific update because of the successful exploitation of it may result in complete compromise of the vulnerable system.
Wow, very serious, very serious. That's brilliant. Thank you, John. I don't know how many people are still using Internet Explorer, but potentially a lot of users still at home are using Internet Explorer. That definitely needs to be patched. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, John. And Pete, you've got one for us as well.
I have, and I've trumped John this time with an 8.8 on the CVSS score. So the one that I had a look at and thought was interesting was 17061. Having said that, John's going to go for a 10 next time, and that'll be the end of that, won't it? Okay, so yeah, this one caught my eye. Basically, it's a Microsoft SharePoint remote execution vulnerability. It is classed as likely to be exploited. The attack complexity is low, and the required privileges are also low, and this obviously contributes to the 8.8, which is reasonably high for a CVSS score. Obviously, for some businesses, even more so these days, SharePoint is an essential tool to allow remote working. The vulnerability basically allows a remote attacker to perform a spoofing attack. The vulnerability exists due to an incorrect processing of user-supplied data in a Microsoft SharePoint. Basically, the attacker can spoof a page content. So I think that is one more so than ever that we need to be aware of.
That's great. Thank you, Pete. I actually know we had a SharePoint publicly aware vulnerability just 2 months ago. So I think definitely that is something you should be protecting, especially with so many people working from home. Now, if you're new to the page, you'll see that along the top we've got the CVE reference for your toolset, a description of the vulnerability, and then we've got the 5 of the 6 factors that we use to recommend the priority of this, along with the Syxsense recommended. So everything from Patch Tuesday is listed inside this website. This page you can access anytime, and as I mentioned, this is available to subscribe. So if you want to be sent an email, you can do so. Wonderful. Thank you very much, guys. So we have a couple of issues. This is actually one that Microsoft keeps putting on its website for the patches that are for Windows 7, SP1, and Windows Server 2008. Certain operations may fail on cluster shared volumes. There still is no update to this. So if you are using Windows 7, Windows Server 2008, and you have a shared volume, please make sure you test before you deploy to your live servers. Test. Make sure you do that test. And in fact, on this on the topic of December's webinar, we're actually going to show you how we do the testing. So it's a chance for me to show you how we test patches that we put into our own product for our customers to deploy. So we'll be showing you how we do that testing. I think it's fascinating how we're able to do it. I'll put it into a couple of slides, and hopefully it will help you to build upon your own testing processes to make sure that your environment is as safe as possible.
Rob, I'm right in saying that we've actually refused to put some content into our console, haven't we? Due to the failure of patches that your guys have tested.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes, and in fact, one of the things we have done, as a great point, I wrote it down. I wasn't going to mention it until the next one, but that KB update for Flash, we have in fact refused to add that to public content. Because a lot of our clients don't know what that patch will actually impact. So we have actually put that as an optional patch. So we haven't made it public for automatic accidental deployment. That's just one of the things that we're looking at when we do develop the content after the testing takes place. If it fails our test, and they are quite rigorous, even though they're published by the vendor, we won't add it into the content. We may put a holding patch in it saying that it's on hold, or we may put a notification into the console for everyone to see that we've pulled a patch based on our own testing. And sometimes it takes an extra 12 hours before we confirm that we're satisfied that there aren't issues. But if we find any issues, we definitely will perform extra testing. So yeah, thank you, Pete. For Windows 10, of all the feature updates, including something called 20H2, I think that's the next feature update version, there is reports, not ours, we haven't seen this ourselves in any of our testing, but there are reports on the Microsoft forums of systems that which have user certificates maybe lost. And what they're saying is that this is probably down to those SSU updates. So if you have those devices at home and you're asking your users to patch their machines and you're asking them to do it manually, potentially you haven't asked them to put the SSU, because some patches are encrypted or have encryption minimum encryption, and that does require the latest SSU in order for your system to support those encryptions. So some patches are SHA-1, some are SHA-2. Everything should now be SHA-2, but if your system doesn't have that key capability, your patch could be installed, or it may fail and roll back, and that could include the rolling back of certificates you've applied to your system, which could cause an extreme nightmare, especially with a lot of workforce remotely not able to access networks to get those certificates back, or may not have admin credentials on their machines to get those types of certificates back. And I'm just going to mention, if you've seen the webinars before, Microsoft have totally changed their feature update documentation. So this slide is just changed to we haven't done it on purpose. This has changed, and I know John is going to take us through it. So John, would you like to walk through the Windows 10 Home and Pro feature update support, please?
Yeah, a few updates from the past month. First one, as we see on the very top, there's a version that I wanted to see in green because this is actually just recently released. This is for Windows 10 feature update 20H2. In previous months, we thought it was going to be called 2009 as their typical version name has been, but they actually went with their code name instead and just called it 20H2. A few things to note as well, based on the colors on the bottom of this particular slide, and this slide is actually specific to consumer versions, so only for Home and Pro. They do typically get a different life cycle than Enterprise, and we call them business versions. The versions on bottom, 1803 as well as 1809, well, again, they are marked as obsolete. No longer use them if you happen to be on these old versions, as 1809 for consumer was just marked as obsolete. That's actually okay if it was just marked as out of date recently. That's the last time you would have received the updates. So you actually have until December, until then you will no longer be getting patches from Microsoft directly. Also, unfortunately, a few versions in the last 2 years, we've noticed they have standardized the end dates. This would be for Windows 10 1903 and 2004. Both spring releases have the same end date as they do for Enterprise. And you'll see that it's actually just coming along the next month. So going from one version, 1809, being marked as, I wouldn't say obsolete, but end of life this month, and then next month, 1903. So overall, I would recommend to anyone, if you're running Windows 10, make sure that regardless, you're at least on 1909 or any newer version too. Can you go to the next slide, Rob? Perfect. And it's for business versions. Enterprise and education do typically get a longer life cycle. Earlier this year, multiple versions were extended due to COVID-19. So a few versions, 1803, 1809, actually have support all the way till next year in May. However, you'll see right there in the middle, a little odd, 1903 again has that same standardized date, and 2004 does too. So it's possible these might get extended, but given that we're within a month, I highly doubt it. If you happen to be running 1903, definitely move up to 1909 or newer. And then 20H2 for business versions as well actually has the longest support lifecycle now, with the exception of long-term versions of Windows 10 all the way to 2023, and that's long support. So if you're comfortable with it, again, always do your testing first. If it works for you, it's not really going to be a major difference over 2004 actually. May as well go through some of those items right now as well. So again, for 20H2, that was released on October 20th. This version does mainly focus on performance improvements, and it is simply, like I mentioned, it's not really a major release. It's more like an incremental update over 2004. And this is very similar to the previous versions we see on this page, 1903 and 1909. 1909 wasn't really a big release over the previous version, so it's just a few changes. As mentioned previously on previous webinars, a new and improved start menu with more fluent design, new ability to change the display's refresh rate rather than have to rely on a third-party product to do so, personalized taskbar icons. The biggest change rather is that the new Chromium-based Edge is now going to be default going forward, and it was provided, of course. You can be on an older version of Windows 10. Now it is default to 20H2. New notifications UI as well as focus assist notifications are finally off by default. Control panels also continuing to be dissolved. and ported into the new Windows 10 settings app instead. And I've been saying this for quite a few years. We've definitely seen this consistently occur. All of the typical options we saw in Windows 7 are slowly getting dissolved. When Windows 10 was released, a lot of them were ported over. Now they're being changed into Windows 10 type apps instead. So we'll continue to see that occur until basically the control panel's gone.
That's
Next
wonderful,
slide,
John. Thank you.
And then also for long-term, won't get it too much into this. This is usually for large-scale environments. They do have a hefty price tag as well, with a bare minimum of how many licenses you want to purchase based on volume licensing. No changes, but as we pointed out last time, last month's Patch Tuesday, mainstream support ended for the original long-term service branch release of Windows 10, but you're still getting updates, of course. That's the point of long-term all the way to 2025.
Lovely. Thank you.
And then for Mac, there was a supplemental update as well, released earlier this month with a few fixes. Would want to prioritize this for anyone that it may apply to. Of course, these supplemental updates may be specific models of Mac, so it may not apply to every single model. But if you happen to see that supplemental update on 10.15.7, prioritize, get that deployed, because there were various areas of it that were being weaponized. Also, Mac OS 11, Big Sur, finally have an update on that one. Earlier this week, Apple did finally announce the release of Mac OS version 11, again, codenamed Big Sur. The newest version of Mac OS will be released tomorrow on November 12th. It was first announced back in June, and far too many Mac users have been anxiously awaiting this new major version. Big Sur comes with a customizable control center where you can toggle brightness, do not disturb, and other settings of choice. As mentioned on the previous webinars, it will include a new notification center that will keep all notifications and widgets in one column, sorting alerts, and grouping related notifications together. The interface will be translucent and very similar to iOS. Some additional apps will also receive updates, as well as new privacy-focused features. Also, Apple says that Mac screens will immediately turn on when opened, which is very similar to how iPhone instantly lights up when you pick up the device. So it'll be interesting to see for any Mac users. I'm sure everyone's going to be happy with it. But anytime there's a new release, there may be a huge influx of patches. So we'll see how it goes in the next few months. For Linux as well, this particular slide is for browsers in Linux, and I had already mentioned a number of these earlier. All the Chromium-based browsers had major security issues pop up. Same with Firefox and Thunderbird. So if any of these happen to apply, it doesn't matter if you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux. The desktop versions did have major vulnerabilities, and I would recommend to prioritize. This is something we don't typically see on this page for Linux, is that they did actually all get a standardized rating. This is just because the OS types may be different, but the vulnerability is still the same. Next slide, please, Rob. When it comes to the OS updates, this will always be a little different. When we look at Linux, Linux is not one brand per se, but rather multiple vendors supporting this particular platform: Oracle Enterprise, Red Hat, SUSE, AWS, Ubuntu, and they are going to typically give different ratings for all their updates. As we see on the left-hand side, we go from important to critical, back to important, down to medium. So it could even be saying important, required might be the same. They're always going to give it a slightly different rating. That's why we recommend focus on CVSS first. That way you get that standardized rating. On the top, there are a few to point out as well. SUSE did have a 9.8 particular update. 9.8 is pretty much near perfectly critical, although they said important. Security update for a boot issue. Update fixes 20 vulnerabilities, including buffer overflow errors. So if you're running that OS, update as well. Also lower in the list for SUSE, 8 additional vulnerabilities with some back-end issues. Red Hat, as well as Red Hat Satellite, which is used for patching those environments internally, definitely make sure to prioritize. There was a critical release update specific to Flash Player as well. Hopefully you're not using it. It's going to be obsolete in the next month or so, but there was an update while it is still technically supported. As well as on the very bottom of this list, Ubuntu attacker can crash or execute arbitrary code inside, I believe it says tmux servers. So make sure that you also prioritize. And again, for Linux, I always recommend prioritize all updates. They tend to be more reliable in patching than you may see with some Microsoft-based systems. Again, always patch them as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, John. And as I mentioned right at the start, these are the most critical ones for the entire month, but potentially they have been superseded already. Now, if that is the case and you are interested in Linux, then we will be publishing a weekly Linux Vulnerability of the Week article, which will list for the operating systems the top 10 or 5 to 10 vulnerabilities of the previous week. And so if you are interested in that, you can subscribe to that page on the website. Thank you, gentlemen. That's brilliant. I think we have a couple of minutes left, and I don't know if we have any questions, but I'll pass it back to Heidi to go through that if there are any.
Hi, Rob. Yeah, we had a few questions. They're really great so far. The first one was, what's the difference between CVE and CVSS?
I think, Mike, Pete, that might be one for you.
Well, yeah, I'll certainly have a go at it.
This last week.
Well, I don't know if it was last week, but it was some point in time. Yeah, so see, the CVE is just a reference really for the vulnerability. It just doesn't give any indication of the actual severity of that. And correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, a CVE can actually reference more than one vulnerability as well, whereas obviously the CVSS score actually rates the severity based on lots of criteria, which I won't go into here, but they sort of have different levels. They put each sort of vulnerability through an algorithm, and out of that comes an actual score. So the two are not really the same thing at all. One is just a reference, and the other is an actual scoring system.
Mm-hmm. And just because a vulnerability has a CVE doesn't mean it's actually an important one. It may actually just be a low severity. The fact is, as a CVE is to reference it. So we actually use the CVE in our solution because it is the universal ID to find a vulnerability, and every CVE is always unique.
Yep, well said, Rob.
That's very cool. The next question is, which third-party vendor releases the most bugs?
That's a dubious honor to have, isn't it?
I would say based on trend, you're looking at products more like Adobe and Microsoft. Microsoft is, I mean, these are different, of course. Microsoft is creates an operating system, but also has their own third-party products that could flow into a Mac system, as well as you can install other various Microsoft products on Linux, as well as even on mobile platforms. So there's a lot that they're branching out there. When it comes to the third party, I would definitely say Adobe. As we've seen over the past 15, 20 years, there are a lot of vulnerabilities with those products. Now they're also releasing a lot of products too. So with so many different product lines, that could, of course, increase that attack vector. But I would say overall, most likely Adobe. And unlike any other third-party vendor, they've also, as I mentioned earlier, tend to standardize their update releases around Patch Tuesday. Sometimes it changes and shifts, but anytime that they have so many updates they're releasing routinely, they may choose a standardized date, in which case they have.
I guess Adobe have got more horses in that race, haven't they? So yeah, it's a little unfair. Sorry, Rob.
I'll say I completely agree. Adobe may not release the most patches by vendor, but they certainly release, in my opinion, from my research I did several months ago, they released the most critical ones, certainly by vendor.
maybe the other vendors aren't admitting to them being critical. That's always the you know.
Well, we use
if you-
CVS, we use CVSS.
Yeah,
So
obviously that,
they
yeah, and
can't
that
get
gets
away
you
with
in
it. Yeah, we
there.
can't
Yeah,
get away with
exactly.
it.
That's the whole point of it. I mean, if you were the vendor of an application, you wouldn't really want to shout out, "Hey, I've got this vulnerability and it's really, really critical." You know, it might not be the wisest thing to do, but there you go.
That's
Well,
brilliant.
great. Thank you, guys. We've ran out of questions and we've also ran out of time.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Heidi. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And also thank you to everyone joining us today, both live. This is available to watch afterwards. There is a recording and you can download it and rewatch it if you need to. We really appreciate you taking the time to spend the last hour with us. And we hope that we've been able to help you prioritize your Patch Tuesday and others. And we look forward to seeing you in December. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Everyone.